Alternative Radio presents Philip Agee on the CIA and Cuba. I'm David Barsamian. The island of Cuba occupies a big place in the imagination and policies of the United States. According to one historian, President Kennedy and his brother Robert were obsessed with the small Caribbean nation. The landscape of U.S.-Cuba relations is dotted with the missile crisis, blockades, embargoes, and boat refugees. Few know the details of the extensive CIA operations against Cuba. They range from sabotage to invasion to biological warfare to assassination plots. At one time, the Miami-based CIA post was the largest outside of headquarters in Langley, Virginia. Since its establishment in 1947, the CIA has run practically all of its business in secret. This is especially true of its covert operations. Philip Agee has pried loose some of those secrets. He was a CIA officer from 1960 to 1968. He served in Ecuador, Uruguay, and Mexico. Since resigning from the CIA, he has written and lectured widely on the agency's clandestine activities. He is the author of Inside the Company and On the Run. And now, Philip Agee.
I did a lot of damage to Cuba and to the Cuban Revolution. I also happen to be a person whose ideas changed. I resigned from the CIA. I was in my last post in Mexico City, and I stayed there. That job was rather odd because when I first went down to South America, at age 25, 1960, I went down as a political officer in the U.S. Embassy in Quito, Ecuador. My cover was as a U.S. diplomat. The same in Uruguay, where I went after 3 years in Ecuador. But when I went to Mexico, I went as the U.S. representative for the 1968 Olympic Games. I went down there calling myself the U.S. Olympic attaché. I was in the U.S. Embassy. My official title was a special assistant to the ambassador, but I worked in the whole Olympic organizing scene because there were hundreds of people of interest to the CIA in that Olympic organizing milieu. There were people from the media, there were people from the PRI, the only political party that counts there really, or at that time it was the case. There were people from the local sports scene, from the cultural life, and so forth. And so that's why I went down there to work in the Olympics 1.5 years before the Games actually happened. But I had already really decided to quit the CIA. And little by little, I began to realize that all of the activities that I and my colleagues were involved in fact, the whole U.S. government program had as its purpose one final goal, and that was to assure stability in what was essentially and inherently a very unstable situation because it was so unfair. The glue that held this system together was political repression. And little by little, I began to turn against the people that we were supporting. We were supporting the status quo there. We were, as I say, seeking stability at all costs, and the glue that held it all together was political repression, in which I was very much involved. And so I began to turn against the peoples that were receiving our support because of their greed, because of the corruption, because of the political repression that was involved, and then decided to stop the work altogether. So about 6 months before the Games, I informed the CIA in writing of my resignation and that it would be effective at the end of the Games. That would be at the end of 1968. And that was the case. It's what happened. And I started a new life without any intention of writing a book or taking any action at all. My idea was to simply start a new life and forget those years in the CIA. One of the things I did was to go back to school. I enrolled in the National University of Mexico in a doctoral program in Latin American Studies. I thought maybe I would get that degree and come back here and teach. But after months, weeks and months really, of doing the reading and writing papers on the conquest and the horror of the conquest, the genocide carried out against the Native American people in what is now Latin America, the United States policies in Latin America through the years. Because of that, I, for some reason, began to get this idea of doing something about what I and my colleagues had been doing in the CIA, i.e. a book. And no one had ever done such a thing. It was a very big step to take. And I finally decided to do it. I began looking for the research materials in Mexico City so that I could reconstruct events and show our participation in the events. But unfortunately, I could not find what I needed there, and I had to choose between the studies and the book. And I was very highly motivated at the time, so I chose the book, went to Europe, and 5 years after I had started, the book was ready. It was out in early 1975. And that kind of started a new life for me because it was an instant bestseller and then came out in many other languages and in the United States here as well. And I began receiving invitations to go all over Europe. And I went to the Caribbean. I went to Central America as well. There were 17 years when I didn't come back to the United States on the advice of lawyers and others whose political judgment I respect. They had all said, don't come back to the United States. You can be much more effective abroad, keep on writing, doing the interviews and so forth, and don't risk prison coming back to the United States. There could be a long and very expensive criminal trial, and you might even go to prison. And so I followed that advice for 17 years, until 1987, when this book, On the Run, was coming out. And my publisher wanted very much for me to come back at that time to do promotional work on the book here. And I thought it over, talked it over with my wife at some length over many months, and we finally decided the time had come to take that risk. Everything I had been doing all through the years had been focused on the United States, naturally. And the thing I wanted most to do all those years was to come back and speak with people, just like you. But I had put it off. Finally, I decided I would do it. And we came back, and it turned out they did not take any action against me. I've been coming back every year since then, 2 or 3 times on trips like this. I am trying to interest people in Cuba, but it's also to denounce this lawless, arrogant, and unconstitutional law in which the government is trying to tell us where we can and cannot go and travel. I myself have been to Cuba many times. I was in Cuba before the revolution, and I was back there in 1971 for the first time since I left the CIA, and I've been back constantly ever since, practically every year. I want to say a few words about the CIA's long war against Cuba. It's been going on now for 35 years, coinciding with the trade embargo. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the background. I'm going to assume that some of you are not. But when we speak of the Cuban Revolution today, we're talking about the development of a process that goes on and goes back more than 100 years. You know, the ideas of the Enlightenment affected the educated elites in Latin America just like they did the Founding Fathers in the United States. And they had their independence movements, which culminated around 1820, 1825, in the independence from Spain of practically all of Spanish colonies in the Western Hemisphere. Cuba was an exception, as was Puerto Rico. The Spanish were able to retain control in those countries. In the latter part of the 19th century, the independence movement in Cuba developed. There was a 10 years war, which failed. And then along came José Martí, who is considered the father of Cuban independence. He was in a Spanish prison cracking rocks or stones for his independence activities as a student. And he eventually got out, came to the United States, formed the Cuban Revolutionary Party, and determined with others to reinitiate the independence movement, independent struggle from Spain. And so in 1895, he goes back to Cuba with the others. Within 2 months, he's dead, killed in action by the Spanish. But the movement goes on, and by 1898, they've more or less defeated the Spanish. That is when McKinley decides to intervene. He sends the Maine, to Havana Harbor there is a mysterious explosion. The ship sinks, and hundreds of sailors are killed. McKinley declares war on Spain and intervenes, snatching independence from the hands of the Cuban independence movement. 4 years military occupation, 1902, Cuba is given a kind of a pseudo-independence by the United States, and it was on the condition that the so-called Platt Amendment be incorporated into their constitution. The Platt Amendment after Orville Platt, the senator. And this law or inclusion in the Cuban Constitution gave the United States the right to unilaterally intervene with military force in Cuba anytime at all to protect U.S. lives and property or simply to restore public order. The Cubans lived with this humiliation for more than 3 decades. Finally, in the early 1950s, along comes a young lawyer and student leader, Fidel Castro. He begins to organize a movement again for Cuban independence from the United States because they were in that typical dependency situation. Cuba had become more or less an island plantation system for the United States. U.S. interests owned the largest and best properties, ranches, cane fields. They owned sugar mills. They owned the utilities, the electricity, the telephones, the public transportation systems, and, of course, the mafia was there in a very big way. This was in the vice, meaning the gambling and the numbers and the drugs and the prostitution and so forth. It was run by the Florida Mafia, led at that time by Meyer Lansky and Santos Traficante, who happened to come from Tampa, my hometown. This was a situation in the early 1950s which the forces or the movement led by Fidel Castro was determined to change. The first major event on their program was the assault on the Moncada barracks in Santiago de Cuba, the second city way out in the eastern portion of the island, which was a total failure. It didn't even last 30 minutes. Fidel's Buick broke down, and everything else that could go wrong went wrong. And most of them were captured. The Batista dictatorship of the time, which had overthrown the civilian government the year before in 1952, and the assault on Moncada is in July of 1953, this military dictatorship was supported by the United States, and I'll give you some examples in just a moment how it was done. But that Batista dictatorship executed about 61 of the 120 or so who assaulted the Moncada barracks in the first day or so. The church intervened, and Fidel and the others were saved. But they were tried, convicted, and sentenced to long prison terms, Fidel for 15 years. They were sent to the prisons on the prison on the Isle of Pines, which is the large island off the southwestern coast of Cuba, which has since been renamed the Isle of Youth. And on that island, there have been work-study programs going on for many, many years now. Tens of thousands of Africans have been educated there, where they have gone to school, and they have also worked in the extensive citrus plantations or citrus groves on the island. They have come from mostly black Africa, from countries like Zambia and Angola and South Africa, Zimbabwe, and so forth, part of the international assistance programs of the revolution. Well, Fidel and the others only served not even 2 years, because there was an amnesty movement which their supporters on the outside organized. It was very successful, and by May 1955 they were out. Within a couple of months they're in Mexico planning to return, training, acquiring weapons, and so forth. It was 1956 when Fidel swam the Rio Grande, over to McAllen, Texas, to meet with Carlos Prio, the civilian president that Batista had overthrown in 1952. And Prio agreed to give Fidel money, gave him $100,000. And with that money, they bought weapons, they continued their training, and they found a yacht on which they could sail back to the far eastern province of Cuba known as Oriente and begin the struggle, the armed struggle again against Batista. This was a most incredible thing that they could survive and carry forth the revolution, because this boat, which they paid $20,000 for, it was owned by an American who lived in Mexico City. had been sunk in a hurricane and spent some time at the bottom. And it had been raised, but it needed a lot of work. And before they could complete their preparations, they had to leave precipitously because the Mexican authorities were closing in. They had a couple of defections from the group, and Batista was on to what they were doing. He had started maritime and air patrols in the space between Mexico and Cuba. And so late one night, after midnight, in a storm, in late November of 1956, they set sail. And it was a nightmare all the way. It was stormy. There was constant seasickness, diarrhea. They ran out of food and water. The navigator fell overboard. Everything happened. And it all ended in a shipwreck, by the way. They ran aground on a mudflat some miles from where they had intended to land. And they had to wade through hip-deep mud up to the shore, leaving behind their weapons, most of them. And then what was waiting on shore? A huge mangrove swamp that swallowed them up. Well, it looked like Moncada all over again, but within a couple of weeks, 12 of the 82 who had sailed had regrouped with Fidel. All the others were either killed or captured by Batista's Army and Air Force because they were on top of them, in fact, from the day they arrived. The Granma was the name of the ship, or the yacht, and it was built of wood in 1943 for a maximum of 25 people. So you can imagine what it was like with 82, plus the weapons, plus the stores, and everything else. It took them a little more than a week to get from Tuxpan on the Mexican coast to Oriente. Well, there were 12 men with Fidel going up into the Sierra Maestra Mountains, this very high, rugged mountain range on the southeastern coast of Cuba, in December 1953. 12 men against Batista's army of 40,000. But the most amazing thing is that they were able in 2 years to defeat Batista's army. Because of the political repression, that dictatorship lost all the support it had. It happens that in 1956, which is the same year that the CIA comes to recruit me at Notre Dame, and the same year of my graduation from there, the CIA sets up a political police for Batista called the BRAC, B-R-A-C. Those are the Spanish initials for the title of the organization. It was called the Bureau for Repression of Communist Activities. A very good cover because Batista used this secret police set up for him by the CIA against all of his political opponents, not just communists. And it became famous or well known for its torture and for its assassinations of Batista's political opponents. It was really a nasty dictatorship. So nasty that in 1958, as the revolutionary forces were making gains very fast, the CIA Inspector General, who had helped set up this BRAC in 1956, made a special trip to Havana to speak to the chief of BRAC and tell him to cool it, to lay off, that he was turning everybody against the regime because of the savageness of this secret police. Well, that didn't happen. By December, the revolutionary forces had defeated the Batista army, and on December 31st, Batista fled to the Dominican Republic. On January 1st, the victory celebrations began and grew larger and larger as Fidel and the other leadership made their way from town to town, city to city, from the extreme eastern part of the island all the way to the west to Havana. And a week later, they entered to this tumultuous political celebration, the largest ever seen in Cuba until that time. Well, in early January 1957, that's 1 month after the Granma arrives. The Granma arrives on December 2nd, I believe, and I was there the first week of January in Cuba on my first trip. And there I was able to savor the food and the dance and the music and some of the vice. And when I got back from Cuba from that trip, the pull of adventure and of travel and so forth was too great to resist. And that's when I wrote to the CIA saying I was ready. And went in. 6 months later, I was in, and as I told you, I went to the Air Force. Well, I was back in the CIA headquarters in the late summer of 1959, the first year of triumph of the revolution, to start the CIA's year-long training program. We would spend the months from September to the end of December in CIA classrooms in Washington studying the national security bureaucracy setup and also the structure of the CIA and its missions. Then in early January of 1960, we would all go down to what we called the farm. It was a large CIA secret training base, the code name of which was Isolation. And we all went down there in early January. The real name of the base was Camp Perry. It was supposedly a U.S. Navy base, when in fact that was simply the cover. It was the CIA's most important training base. It was a very large expanse of property just outside Williamsburg, Virginia, along the shores of one of the rivers down in the Tidewater area. It was a very special place. It had a landing strip. It had an area for training in parachute jumping and also an area for jumping and for practicing with airdrops of supplies and equipment of all sorts. It had an area for explosives training, ranges for all types of weapons. We were assigned to a very special section of the base, which included our barracks, military-style barracks, and classrooms, and an officers' club, and a baseball diamond, and a gym for martial arts training, that kind of thing. And we would be there for 7 months until the end of July, more or less, of 1960. Well, the Cuban Revolution was going very strong from January 1959 on. Any Cuban who was involved or who has studied that period can tell you that the easy part was achieving power and the overthrow of the Batista dictatorship. Making the revolution after taking power was the really hard part. That was the transformation of Cuban society. And they had lots of obstacles to overcome, many of them coming from the United States. The first problems that Cuba had with the United States were the trials of Batista's murderers and torturers who were captured. The chief of BROC, by the way, got away. He went to Miami and later on was continued to work for the CIA. But his deputy was captured. And this man had been the principal BROC liaison officer with the CIA offices in the U.S. Embassy in Havana. They tried him. He was convicted and sentenced to death. In fact, he was not the only one. There were lots. And these trials were public. They were broadcast on television, and they were held in the National Sports Arena, an enclosed sports palace in Havana. They were seen in the United States as circus show trials, and the United States, various figures in the government denounced them, including senators who stood up in the Senate and called for an end to this so-called Cuban, quote-unquote, bloodbath. And this was the beginning of Cuba's problems with the United States. In the case of this deputy chief of BROC, once he was sentenced to the paredon, that's the firing squad, the CIA intervened with Che Guevara. You all know who he is, the Argentine physician and revolutionary who had joined with Fidel and his group in Mexico and had come across on the Granma. Che refused to take action. In fact, he told the CIA, we are going to execute this man either as a murderer and a torturer for Batista or as an agent of the United States. And the next morning, the man was shot by the firing squad. The CIA chief at the time in Havana was quoted then as saying, this is an open declaration of war. And that was the beginning of the problems that Cuba would have with the United States. By March 1959, just 3 months after the triumph of the revolution, Eisenhower and his National Security Council were discussing ways to overthrow the government and replace them with people who were more aligned with U.S. interests. So it happened very early on. Before 1959 was over, the CIA was already developing a counter-revolutionary underground. They were training people in such things as explosives and sabotage. And they had begun airdrops to a counter-revolutionary guerrilla movement in the Escambray Mountains, another rugged mountain range on the south-central coast of Cuba. So already in 1959, the United States government, through the CIA, is attempting to destroy the revolution. Well, in 1960, while I was down at Camp Perry in the training program, we were a group of about 55, by the way, which the CIA brought in that year. of which only about 5 were women. By March 1960, Eisenhower had signed the CIA's plan for overthrowing the revolution, and that is the plan which led to the Bay of Pigs in 1961. The plan had 4 main aspects. 1, the formation of a unified political leadership for the Cuban counter-revolution outside Cuba. This they did in Miami. They call it the Revolutionary Democratic Front. A second part of it was propaganda directed toward Cubans in Cuba, undermining the revolution, accusing the leadership of having betrayed the revolution, denouncing, of course, Batista, admitting that his regime was repressive, but at the same time saying that the Cuban Revolution had been betrayed, that it was taken over by communists, and so forth. That was the propaganda side of it. And this started very early on with Radio Swan on Swan Island, a Honduran possession in the Caribbean. Swan Island was a project of the Gibraltar Steamship Corporation based in New York City, a company that, despite the name, never owned a boat or ship of any kind. It was simply a front for this propaganda operation at Radio Swan. A third part of the CIA's plan was to develop and expand the underground in Cuba and train more saboteurs, more people who could try to undermine and hurt the economy. The fourth part was then to recruit an invasion force. And both in Havana and from among the exile community in Florida, in Miami mostly, they recruited about 2,000 people, gave them some training in Florida, but then sent them over to a base specially built for the purpose in the western highlands of Guatemala. And then in the months ahead through 1960 and into 1961, they were trained in Guatemala. We knew, those of us in the agency at the time, even though we weren't involved in this type of activity, we knew that an invasion was coming, but we didn't know when. It happened that in the middle of 1960, when I finished the CIA's training course at this special base down around Williamsburg, I was assigned to the Western Hemisphere Division of the Clandestine Services, the Secret Operations Division of the agency. And the Western Hemisphere Division was concerned with Latin America. And I had Spanish in high school and college, and so I was one of the various people assigned there. There was a great expansion of this division because of the influence of the Cuban Revolution. Our job was to neutralize that influence or that impact and to isolate the Cuban Revolution. The policy was at that time that any new trainee who just came out of the program would have to spend about, or at least a year, working in headquarters in Washington before being considered for an overseas assignment. I was very eager to get an overseas assignment, and you can imagine my surprise and thrill when, not even 1 month on the job, I was called into the division chief's office and asked if I would like to take a job down in South America. And I couldn't say yes fast enough. I went into full-time Spanish training so that I'd be able to take over agents right away who spoke nothing but Spanish. And I was assigned to the U.S. Embassy as a diplomat, that was the cover, political officer, in Quito, the capital of Ecuador. Before 1960 was over, this is early December that year, at age 25, I was down in Ecuador taking over my first secret operations for the agency. And as I mentioned, they were targeted on the Cuban presence in Ecuador, their diplomatic mission, and against their supporters in that country.
You're listening to Philip Agee on the CIA and Cuba. This is Alternative Radio. You can order copies of this program by calling us toll-free at 1-800-444-1977. Or you can go to our website, alternativeradio.org. Again, our website, alternativeradio.org. Stay tuned at the end for complete details on ordering.
In early 1961, we knew this invasion was coming. We were out of the loop, kind of, in Ecuador. But we knew it was starting on April 15th, a Saturday, when 2 B-26 light bombers, these are World War II vintage twin-engine light bombers, with the insignias of the Cuban Air Force, landed in Florida, claiming to be defectors. One landed in Key West and one landed in Miami. they had carried out raids on Cuban air bases. The fact was they were part of the Cuban Exile Air Force trained by the CIA in Puerto Cabezas, Nicaragua, with the full cooperation of the Somoza dictatorship of the time. And the base at Puerto Cabezas was nicknamed, or given the code name, Happy Valley. And the agency gave the Cuban exiles, or trained them, gave them about 17 B-26s and some C-54s. That's the military version of the DC-4, twin-engine propeller plane. And by April 15th, when this raid took place, the invasion force was leaving for the Bay of Pigs on the south coast of Cuba. They had about 6 ships and some landing craft. The force was supposed to wipe out Castro's air force so that one of the essential conditions for success could be achieved, that is, air superiority over the beach. The plan was to take a beachhead at the Bay of Pigs and hold it. There was a small airstrip there. Have to hold it for 72 hours, and then the CIA would fly in the civilian political leadership, which they had at altogether waiting for the flight over at Opalaca, a Marine Air Base, air station just outside Miami. They had to hold it for about 72 hours. The political leadership would come in, and they would declare themselves a government in arms. They would then request assistance from the United States, and the Marines were all ready to come ashore. They were on ships just across the horizon to the south of the Bay of Pigs. And as it happened, the U-2 reconnaissance on the Sunday, the day after that raid, showed that they had not wiped out the Cuban Air Force. Fidel still had something like 3 T-33 trainers with machine guns and I think 4 Sea Furies. These are British-built, single-engine fighter bombers, and 1 B-26 left. I think they had 8 planes left, and they had, I think, 6 pilots to fly them. That's on the revolutionary side. And so the CIA went to Kennedy and asked permission for another pre-invasion raid to finish off the Cuban Air Force. And there had already been such a stink about the Saturday raid. It had gone around the world, and the Cubans had shown it all on television. It was so transparent, everyone knew that these were not defecting pilots from the Cuban Air Force, but they were CIA people, that Kennedy decided they would not have another raid before the invasion. They would be able to fly support once the invasion occurred. And this decision of his not to have a second raid was one of the principal reasons why the whole thing failed. The other reason was that there was no uprising, and that was another of the essential conditions. It happened that the Cubans, that is the revolutionary government, had very effective security and intelligence organizations from the time that Fidel and the others were in prison on the Isle of Pines. They were developing these services. And they had been very effective in penetrating the exile community. They knew everything that was going on. They knew the invasion was coming. And so beginning the 1st of April, they began rounding up thousands of people all over the island that they thought might just show support for the invasion when it did come. And on the very day of the invasion, April 17th, they arrested something like 35,000 people in Havana alone and just put them on ice for a while. And so there was no show of support for the invasion. There was no general uprising, and that was an essential condition for success. It was all over in 72 hours. Within a couple of days, the Cubans had something like 1,400 prisoners. And negotiations began early on for their ransom, reaching into the next year, and I believe it was December 1962 when Kennedy finally got their freedom by sending a shipment worth $52 million in medicine and food over to Cuba, and the Cubans then released the Bay of Pigs people. Many of those Bay of Pigs veterans went on to bigger and better things as terrorists for the CIA through the 1960s, 70s, and into the 1980s. I'll mention a couple of things that they did in a few minutes. But I think it's very important to understand that there was no lesson learned in this Bay of Pigs disaster, which until then was the biggest disaster the CIA had ever had. Kennedy appointed a special commission of inquiry following the disaster. It was known as the Taylor Committee under Maxwell Taylor, the general who was one of Kennedy's principal military advisors. The Taylor Committee rendered its report in June of 1961, and the conclusion of the report was that the United States cannot live with this Cuban Revolution as a neighbor over the long haul. We should develop new and more effective operations and activities to weaken and destroy the revolution. Through the summer of 1961, the CIA headed an interagency group which drew up a new plan for attacking Cuba, and Kennedy signed off on this in November 1961. It was known as Operation Mongoose. The man who was assigned to run this program was General Edward Lansdale, a legendary figure within the CIA for his work in the Philippines and later on in Vietnam. One of the things I didn't mention, and I should have, and I'll go back to it, was that in 1960, the summer of 1960, as a part of Eisenhower's March Plan, the CIA began plotting Fidel's assassination. And they did it by going through the mafia. The mafia had lost everything in Cuba with the revolution because the revolution closed down the casinos, they closed down the numbers games, they stopped the drug trade, they took about 10 or 12,000 prostitutes and sent them for training in the textile industry. And so the mafia had nothing left. And the CIA went to the mafia knowing that they had their contacts, they had counter-revolutionary contacts on the island from before, and that they stood a lot to gain if they could overthrow the revolution and get a foothold there again. And so the principal figures who worked with the agency were the head of the mafia in Chicago, Sam Giancana, and his principal lieutenant, Johnny Rosselli, together with Santos Traficante again in Florida. The agency gave poison pills to Johnny Rosselli, who in turn gave them to Tony de Verona, who was the CIA's man running the Revolutionary Democratic Front. And the plan was to assassinate Fidel with this poison on the eve of the Bay of Pigs invasion. Of course, we know it didn't happen. De Verona, by the way, passed the pills to someone in Cuba who had access in a restaurant where Fidel and Raul and Che frequently ate. Those were the three perennial candidates for CIA assassination plots. Under Operation Mongoose, the assassination plots continued. And the important part of that plan, Operation Mongoose, which Kennedy, as I say, approved in writing in November of 1961, was that by October of 1962, the revolution would be overthrown. These assaults would accumulate in that month. The Cubans, through their own intelligence organizations, knew about this new plan. They knew about the month October of 1962 being the target date for overthrow of the revolution through new assaults. And so they went to the Soviets early in 1962 and got their agreement to station intermediate-range nuclear-tipped missiles in Cuba. And this is what led to the missile crisis of October 1962, the only time the world has been really within a hair of a nuclear conflagration. It is a very good example of how these covert activities or covert operations will boomerang. And there are many, many examples through the years that I could tell you, but we don't have time for that many. Going on rather quickly, I would simply mention that Kennedy had second thoughts after the missile crisis. And by the summer and fall of 1963, he seems to have been convinced that something had to be done, some kind of détente reached with Cuba, some relaxation or improvement in relations. And so he sent a friend of his, it was Jean Daniel, the editor of Nouvel Observateur, a news magazine like Newsweek, published in Paris. He sent Jean Daniel to Havana to discuss with Fidel, as his secret emissary, to discuss with Fidel ways in which some kind of relaxation, some kind of improvement in relations with Cuba could be achieved. Jean Daniel was sitting with Fidel in his office talking about this in Havana when the aide came in with the first word for Fidel that Kennedy had been assassinated. That very day, that very same day, November 22nd, 1963, the CIA was giving a murder weapon to a Cuban in Paris. It was Desmond Fitzgerald, a man whom I knew. He was one of the most senior men working against Cuba in this special Cuba task force within the CIA. He gave this weapon to Rolando Cubela, who had been a student leader in Cuba, significant figure in the revolution, but who had turned against it and was working for the agency. He had access to Fidel. The weapon was a hypodermic syringe which was disguised as a ballpoint pen, and it was to be loaded with a poison called black leaf 40, which is very fast-acting, and this man, Cubela, was to inject it suddenly on Fidel, and he would be dead pretty quick. He never was able to do it, obviously, but he did get caught, Cubela, and sentenced to 30 years in prison. Johnson, when he took over from Kennedy, remember that he made that comment, which has been republished many times, relating how when he became president, he discovered that we were, in his words, running a murder incorporated in the Caribbean. He backed off on the assassination plots because Kennedy had been assassinated, for one thing, I believe. And it wasn't until Nixon became president in 1969 that these activities were again renewed. Nixon, you know, had been the point man for the Eisenhower administration in supervising all these anti-Cuban activities in the last years of the Eisenhower administration, including the Bay of Pigs, including the assassination plots, which began when Nixon was vice president. But Nixon, by the way, began meteorological warfare against Cuba, seeding clouds over non-agricultural areas where there would be torrential downpours, and then no rains over the cane fields. I was in Cuba on my first trip after I'd left the CIA in 1971 with Nixon in the White House, when the Cubans were slaughtering more than 500,000 pigs. The CIA had introduced African swine fever, which decimated the Cuban porcine herds. This was the first outbreak of this disease in the Western Hemisphere in this century, and the CIA did it. Pork was a major source of protein in the Cuban diet, and still is. But at that time, it was a catastrophe, what they had to do to stop this disease. And then they had to start all over again with what they had left in terms of undiseased animals to begin developing their herds all over again. This was under Nixon. But Nixon also is a very good example of the boomerang effect, or the adage that what goes around comes around, because they were Cuban exiles trained by the CIA and who had worked for the CIA, who were arrested burgling the Democratic National Committee in the Watergate complex in Washington in June 1972. So Nixon bit the dust, I guess you could say, on this Cuban thing. And you remember that Nixon was so paranoid that he bugged himself. You remember that, don't you? And those tapes were eventually pried loose by the court. And there was the conversation, Nixon with his chief of staff, Haldeman, right after the Watergate break-in and arrests, telling Haldeman, we've got to cover this up because, the quote is, it all tracks back to the Bay of Pigs, meaning to his associations with the mafia and his involvement in the assassination plots against Fidel, which until that time had not been revealed. It wasn't until the mid-1970s when the U.S. Senate and the House of Representatives conducted their investigations, and then the Senate committee under Frank Church, the Democrat of Idaho, came up with 8 different CIA assassination plots against Fidel. The Cuban government has provided the evidence to the United States government of more than 30 different CIA assassination plots against Fidel. Well, we all know that Nixon took that fat retirement instead of impeachment, and Ford appointed George Bush director of the CIA, and it was during the period of his directorship of the CIA that a number of things happened, including CIA, that is Cuban exile involvement and these are people trained by the CIA in the assassination in Washington, D.C. of Orlando Letelier, the leader of the Chilean exile community. Nixon's great success in Latin America was, of course, the overthrow of the Allende government, a democratically elected civilian government in Chile, and its replacement by the most savage dictatorship, perhaps, of this century in Latin America, the Pinochet dictatorship, which was in power for 17 years and which killed thousands of people. That was Nixon's principal triumph in his foreign policy in Latin America. Well, another thing that happened under Bush was not even 2 weeks after the murder of Letelier in Washington, other Cuban exiles who had also been trained by and worked for the CIA. This was a group under Orlando Bush, the former pediatrician, who right now is in Miami selling his paintings and going scot-free, a principal terrorist. They blew up a Cubana civilian airliner just after it had taken off from Barbados on its way back to Havana, and all 73 people aboard were killed. That was under Bush. When that was under Bush as director of the CIA. When Jimmy Carter came in, there was a change in policy. There was a relaxation of tension. Briefly, the travel ban was lifted, and the Cubans were allowed to establish a diplomatic office in Washington, an intersection, it's called. The United States did the same thing in Havana. And both were, in effect, embassies, although they are still called, in the case of the United States intersection of the Swiss embassy in Havana. But for all practical purposes, these are embassies. And it wasn't until the last year or so of the Carter administration, beginning in 1979, that he was forced to harden relations with Cuba because the Republican Party was all over him about this so-called Soviet Combat Brigade that they had known about in Cuba since the missile crisis, but which the Republicans made a very big deal of. And so things began to harden even under Carter toward the end of his presidency, and then naturally when Bush and Reagan came in as president, they got even worse. One of the things that Nixon had done, by the way, was to renew the assassination plots against Fidel. And under Reagan and Bush, you remember, some of you, those arrogant remarks at the very beginning in January 1981, Haig, for example, saying that we're going to go to the source of the troubles in El Salvador, for example. He meant, of course, Cuba. And there were a whole series of new operations against Cuba under Reagan and Bush. There was a new outbreak of porcine fever, African swine fever, during the last year of the Carter administration, but then there was hemorrhagic dengue, which had all the signs of being a CIA operation, which broke out in the 1980s on 2 occasions in Cuba. There again, it was the first outbreak in generations in Latin America of this particular type of hemorrhagic dengue. So it was biological warfare all over again against Cuba. And naturally, the economic strangulation went on and on all through the years, through the blockade, through attempts to destroy Cuban foreign trade. Nevertheless, the Cubans have been able to survive and somehow keep going. They have installed quite a few reforms which were just unthinkable only a few years ago, and you can see them if you travel to Cuba. But I would simply mention this, that among the achievements of the Cuban Revolution, and they have determined not to lose these achievements, are in the fields of health and education. And I would simply mention this, that Cuba has developed more teachers, it has more teachers per capita than any other country in the world. And it has one of the most highly educated populations in the world. It has eliminated illiteracy. It did that early on with the National Literacy Campaign in 1961. The whole emphasis on education has continued, and despite this catastrophic situation of the recent years, not one single school has closed. On the public health side, Cuba has more doctors per capita than any other country in the world. And during this special period, not one clinic has had to close. That, too, is a remarkable achievement. As a matter of fact, which to me is just amazing, is that they have reduced the infant mortality figure from 10.2 per 1,000 live births to 9.4. And that, all of these achievements on a per capita national income, according to the CIA's World Factbook, with a per capita national income of only $1,500 per year. Compare that with the United States with a per capita income of $22,500 per year. Their infant mortality at 9.4 is equal, it's on a par with any developed country, with the developed countries, with the United States. It's even lower than it is in major cities in the United States like Washington or New York or Chicago or Los Angeles. Cuban life expectancy, the other indicator for the public health, is also interesting. A Cuban man or male born today is expected to live 74 years on average. A man born in the United States today is expected to live 72 years. And women is the same, 79 years in both countries. But compare Cuba with Mexico or Brazil. And remember that when you consider Cuba, it has to be in the context of Latin America. And the comparisons with the rest of Latin America, it cannot be taken out of context, whether you're discussing democracy or whether you're discussing the quality of life. In fact, the Cubans had been able to achieve the highest quality of life in all of Latin America, despite the problems with the United States and despite the blockade. Well, Mexico has twice the per capita income of Cuba, and their infant mortality is 20, more than twice what it is in Cuba. Brazil has half again as much per capita income per year as Cuba, and its infant mortality is 67 compared to 9.4. So you can see that there is an incredible achievement here through the revolutionary process that is now 35 years old. Thank you very much.
That was Philip Agee on the CIA and Cuba. He spoke in Santa Cruz, California. This classic from the AR archives was recorded in 1994. Philip Agee is a former Central Intelligence Agency officer who served in Latin America. Since resigning from the CIA, he has been an outspoken critic of the agency's covert operations. He's the author of Inside the Company and On the Run. This program is produced by Alternative Radio, an unembedded award-winning weekly series based in Boulder, Colorado. Since its inception in 1986, AR is independent. We are supported solely by listeners just like you. We feature such voices as Arundhati Roy, Howard Zinn, Noam Chomsky, Tariq Ali, and Naomi Klein. We've also done a series of programs on the CIA with John Stockwell, Alfred McCoy, and Gary Webb. To access our vast catalog, go to our website, alternativeradio.org. Again, our website, alternativeradio.org. To place a credit card order for the program you just heard, Philip Agee on the CIA and Cuba, call us toll-free at 1-800-444-1977. Again, that's 1-800-444-1977. Or you can order online at our website, alternativeradio.org. You can also send in your check. CDs and cassettes are $15 plus $1 for postage. Printed transcripts are $9 even. Please indicate the format you'd like. Our address, AR, P.O. Box 551, Boulder, Colorado, 80306. Bob DeBolt recorded the program. I'm David Barsamian. Thank you for listening. We go out with Carlos Puebla, the great Cuban troubadour, singing Y en eso llegó Fidel, and then came Fidel.
Aquí pensaban seguir ganando el 100% con casas de apartamentos y echar al pueblo a sufrir y seguir de modo cruel contra el pueblo conspirando para seguirlo explotando, y en eso llegó Fidel. Y se acabó la diversión, llegó el comandante y mandó a parar. Y se acabó la diversión, llegó el comandante y mandó a parar. Aquí pensaban seguir, tragando y tragando tierra, sin sospechar que en la sierra se alumbraba el porvenir, y seguir de modo cruel la costumbre del delito, hacer de Cuba un garito, y en eso llegó Fidel. Y se acabó la diversión, llegó el comandante y mandó a parar. Y se acabó la diversión, llegó el comandante y mandó a parar. Aquí pensaban seguir, diciendo que los cuatreros, forajidos bandoleros, asolaban al país, y seguir de modo cruel, con la infamia por escudo, difamando a los barbudos, y en eso llegó Fidel. Y se acabó la diversión, llegó el comandante y mandó a parar. Y se acabó la diversión, llegó el comandante y mandó a parar. Aquí pensaban seguir.